Darkness settled slowly over the docks of Araga Harbor on a cold January morning in 1946. But it was not the same darkness Japan had known during the long, violent years of the war. This was different, quieter, heavier, shaped not by the thunder of artillery or the burning glow of cities under assault, but by the sound of a country trying to understand what the end of defeat truly meant. A thin mist floated above the water, blurring the outlines of the American transport ship anchored just offshore. Its deck lights shimmered in the rippling tide, reflecting like distant lanterns guiding thousands of former prisoners home. Among them stood rows of Japanese women nurses, civilians, clerks, factory workers, some carrying infants born in captivity, others clutching small cloth bundles containing the few belongings they had managed to keep. Their faces were tired, pale from months confined behind wire, but not hardened. Instead, there was something else, an emotion many of them hesitated to name: uncertainty, fear, and yet, beneath all of it, a quiet astonishment that had followed them since the moment American guards had processed their repatriation forms, handed them warm blankets, and offered medical treatment without a trace of the brutality they had expected. For years, they had been told a different story. Japanese wartime propaganda warned that Americans were monsters, demons who tortured captives, violated women, and slaughtered the helpless without mercy. Children were instructed to jump from cliffs rather than fall into enemy hands. Civilians practiced self-destruction drills. Women prepared to kill their own infants if the Americans landed on their shores. These stories had been repeated endlessly in the newspapers, in schoolrooms, in the broadcasts of the Imperial Japanese Army. By the final years of the war, fear had crystallized into certainty. Surrender meant death, and yet here they were alive. The sound of boots on metal echoed across the deck as U.S. Navy personnel guided the women gently down the gangway. Some of the female returnees bowed deeply. Others kept their eyes lowered, unsure if the kindness masked something cruel. But the Americans simply directed them toward the receiving area, where Japanese doctors, now working under U.S. orders, waited to examine them before they were released into their homeland. A homeland many feared would not be the same. The war had ended months earlier, on the 2nd of September 1945, but its ghost still lingered. Tokyo lay in ruins, its skyline broken by firestorms and relentless bombing. Food shortages spread across the archipelago. Millions of soldiers had not yet returned from China, Manchuria, Burma, or the Pacific Islands. At every port, families gathered daily, waiting for ships that sometimes never came. With each arrival, the docks erupted in cries of relief or agony. Some women stepping off the American vessel had no way of knowing whether their husbands, brothers, or parents were still alive, but even that uncertainty was overshadowed by something stranger, something that challenged everything they had believed. Where were the tortures, the starvation, the cruelty the Imperial Army had sworn the enemy would unleash? Instead, many of the women had been shocked by the rations they were given: white bread, canned meat, chocolate, vitamins, foods they had never tasted before. They had been treated for malaria, pneumonia, and malnutrition by American doctors who worked long hours in improvised clinics. Some had received vaccinations. Infants had been provided with powdered milk. There were female American nurses who spoke gently, offering hygiene supplies and clean clothing to the women raised on wartime propaganda. It was as if reality itself had betrayed them, and for the Americans, it was part of a carefully constructed policy. After years of documenting the horrific treatment of Allied prisoners at Japanese camps, Bataan, Burma-Thailand Railway, Sandakan U.S. leadership understood that how they treated Japanese captives after victory would shape the future of the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had insisted that Japan's surrender must be followed not by humiliation, but by controlled, disciplined humanitarian engagement. The occupation was intended to dismantle militarism, not dehumanize a nation. Treating Japanese civilians and female prisoners humanely was not only a moral imperative, it was a strategic one. Yet the women returning home did not see strategy. They only saw the difference between fear and reality. On Saipan, women had been shocked when American Marines provided medical treatment instead of bayoneting them. On Guam, captured nurses had wept openly when U.S. soldiers offered water and bandaged their wounds. Across the Philippines and Pacific Islands, women held in camps had been surprised when American guards celebrated the birth of their children, bringing blankets and extra rations, but returning to Japan, they carried this contradiction silently. Some wondered if they would face accusations of collaboration. Others feared being shunned. Still, others struggled to express the bewildering truth that the feared enemy had treated them with dignity at a moment when their own empire had collapsed. As their feet touched Japanese soil, the women looked around, absorbing the sight of American military police standing alongside Japanese port officials. The rising sun was faint behind the clouds, filtering through smoke from nearby coal burners struggling to revive the battered port. Civilians waiting at the dock stared at the returning women with a mix of relief, curiosity, and confusion. What had they seen? What had happened overseas? Had the enemy been as vicious as they were told? Or was the truth more complicated? The women stepped forward, holding tightly to the lessons of captivity, lessons that challenged the foundation of everything they had been taught. Many would remain silent for years, unwilling to speak openly about the compassion they had received. Others would eventually share their stories, describing in careful detail the shock, the disbelief, and the uneasy gratitude they felt toward American soldiers who had been instructed to treat them according to the Geneva standards their own nation had never signed. And as they moved into the crowd, their footsteps echoed softly across the pier, footsteps leading toward a home forever changed by defeat, and toward a truth they had never expected to carry. The road away from the docks wound through the shattered remains of Yokohama, a city once vibrant with merchants, shipbuilders, and busy streets, but now scarred by months of firebombing. The women repatriated from American camps walked or rode in transport trucks through these ruins in silence, absorbing a landscape that mirrored the emotional wreckage inside them. Wooden homes were reduced to charcoal skeletons. Steel beams twisted upward like metal claws. Families boiled thin soups over makeshift stoves built from broken bricks. Children with hollow faces gathered around the convoys, watching the returnees with wide, curious eyes, as if trying to understand where these women had been and why they looked both healthier and more fragile than those who had survived the war at home. Among the returnees was Nakamura Aya, a young typist captured in the Philippines in early 1945 when American forces retook Manila. She had expected death or worse. Instead, she found herself in a U.S.-managed civilian camp where she was given food, shelter, and vaccinations. She could still recall the strangeness of the first night, how the guards had spoken to her through interpreters, how the nurses had checked her temperature with care, how she had been given shoes when her own were worn through. Now, as the sound of distant construction echoed across the city, Aya looked at her homeland and wondered which world had treated her more gently, the world she had been raised to defend, or the world she had been taught to fear. Her experience was not unique. Japanese women repatriated from Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Leyte, and camps across the Philippines carried similar stories. Many had been civilians working for the imperial forces. Others were nurses who had followed the army across the Pacific. Some were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some had lost family members to the chaos of evacuation. Others had seen fierce combat up close. But nearly all had entered American custody with terror in their hearts, from the American perspective. However, the humane treatment of civilians and female captives was a matter of both principle and strategy. By 1944 and 1945, the United States had learned with painful clarity the consequences of Japanese propaganda. On Saipan, thousands of civilians had leapt from cliffs rather than surrender, convinced the Americans would torture them. The deaths shook American forces deeply, prompting leadership to refine their psychological and humanitarian approach. Military commanders issued repeated orders: treat civilians and prisoners, especially women and children, with the utmost care. Doing so would counter Japanese misinformation and prevent further mass suicides. American military leadership understood that Japan's social structure made women powerful transmitters of experience. If they returned home with stories contradicting wartime propaganda, the psychological impact could be significant. In the long-term plans for occupation, this mattered. Rebuilding Japan required dismantling the ideology of ultranationalism that had fueled the empire. Every humane act was a brick removed from that ideological wall, but for Japanese women inside the camps, this strategic reasoning was invisible. All they saw were guards who offered food instead of blows, doctors who treated wounds rather than ignored them, and nurses who taught them how to use soap, toothbrushes, and powdered milk, items rare even in many Japanese households during the war. Some women later admitted that the shock of receiving chocolate from American soldiers was almost disorienting. A few had burst into tears, overwhelmed by the contradiction between expectation and reality. The moral dissonance was intense, raised. In a society where surrender was shameful and enemy kindness unimaginable, the women found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. Humanity existed on both sides of the war. The psychological collision between propaganda and lived experience left many silent, unsure how to speak of what they had seen. For American soldiers, it was also a complex encounter. Many had lost friends to Japanese forces. Many had seen the brutality inflicted on Allied posts. Yet orders were orders, and more importantly, many soldiers believed deeply in the principle that the United States must behave differently from the empire it had defeated. A Marine on Saipan wrote in his diary that caring for Japanese civilians was the hardest thing I've done, but the right thing. Another soldier described carrying an injured Japanese girl to a medical tent, admitting that the act felt like placing my hatred in the fire and watching it burn away. This emotional shift was not universal. Anger ran deep, and battles had been fierce. But enough American personnel treated their captives with fairness that thousands of women returned to Japan with stories no one had expected from the Japanese leadership's perspective. The arrival of these repatriated civilians was politically delicate. The Imperial Army had indoctrinated the population for decades with messages of racial superiority, divine mission, and enemy barbarism. Now, women were returning with stories that challenged all of it. The Japanese government, already under strict supervision from American occupation authorities, discouraged public discussion of wartime propaganda failures, but word still spread quietly through neighborhoods, telling of American camps where prisoners were fed, clothed, and treated medically. In some families, this sparked relief. In others, it sparked resentment, confusion, or disbelief. Mothers asked daughters if the stories were true. Neighbors listened in stunned quiet. Some accused the women of exaggeration or collaboration. A few rejected the accounts entirely, unwilling to accept that the enemy they had feared for years had shown compassion. The psychological shift was slow, uneven, and deeply personal. The women themselves carried private battles, survivor's guilt, shame for having surrendered, gratitude mixed with humiliation, a longing to speak paired with a fear of being misunderstood. Many wrote their experiences in diaries they hid. Some spoke decades later in oral histories, describing the strange moment when they realized the Americans were not killing them, when they were handed warm soup, clean blankets, or medicine instead of violence. For many, it was the first time they had questioned the infallibility of the Japanese wartime government. As Reconstruction began and Japan's infrastructure slowly rose from the ashes, the quiet testimonies of these female returnees became part of a larger national reckoning. They were not loud voices, nor politically powerful ones, but they carried a truth that mattered. The humanity shown in the aftermath of war could be as transformative as the war itself, and as the women walked deeper into their broken homeland, the memory of American generosity followed them like a faint, steady light, one that would shape their understanding of enemy, nation, and self long after the occupation began. In the weeks following their return, the decisive turning point in the story of Japan's female prisoners of war unfolded not on a battlefield, not in a military tribunal, but in the quiet corners of homes, community centers, and makeshift shelters. scattered across the ruined cities of post-war Japan. It happened in whispered conversations, exchanged glances, and hesitant admissions spoken between women who had finally found the courage to describe what they had seen. It was not an event, marked by a single date, a single place, or a single command. Instead, it was a gradual but undeniable shift, a moment when Japanese civilians began to realize that the enemy they had feared with absolute certainty had been more humane in defeat than their own leaders had been in power. The turning point began when the first diaries and testimonies circulated among families. Some were only a few sentences long, written on scraps of paper carried from the camps. Others were detailed memories recounted to close friends. One woman described how American guards had lined up to give their rations to a malnourished baby in the camp. Another wrote of a medical officer who had spent hours treating a group of Japanese women suffering from tropical fever, refusing rest until their temperatures stabilized. A former nurse from Guam spoke softly of the moment she realized the American soldiers escorting her were deliberately walking ahead to give her privacy as she composed herself after days of fear. These stories, small on their own, carried enormous collective weight. They contradicted years of indoctrination. They challenged the certainty of propaganda. They forced civilians to confront a question many had avoided since surrender. If the Americans were capable of dignity, compassion, and respect for prisoners, then what else had their own government lied about? At the core of this shift was an even more difficult truth. By the time these women returned home, the Japanese public had already heard testimony from liberated Allied posts describing starvation, brutality, forced march, and the horrors of camps run by the Imperial Army. Newspapers now overseen by the Allied occupation published reports on war crimes trials in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Manila. Japanese civilians learned of the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the torture of prisoners, and medical experiments conducted in Manchuria, and now, in contrast, they heard from their own women who had been told to expect atrocities at the hands of the Americans that they had instead been fed, safeguarded, and treated as humans. This contrast became the decisive moment. It marked a psychological transition for Japan, a point at which the myth of the empire's moral purity cracked under the weight of lived experience. It did not happen all at once, and not everyone accepted it, but the women's testimony, reshaped by the quiet authority of trauma and survival, was more powerful than any military communique or forced declaration. The immediate consequences of this shift were subtle but profound. Families who once praised martyrdom began to question the ideology that demanded it. Mothers who had urged their daughters to jump from cliffs now listened with shaking hands as those same daughters described Americans gently preventing such suicides. Teachers who had once lectured students about the cruelty of Western nations found themselves unable to explain why American medical officers had treated Japanese prisoners with professionalism that the empire had rarely extended to its own subordinate populations. Even within the Japanese government, there was recognition of the importance of this moment. Officials tasked with reintegrating repatriated civilians quietly noted that many women returned in better physical condition than those who had survived the war at home. Some Japanese doctors, newly working under American supervision, reported that infant mortality among repatriated babies had been lower in U.S.-managed camps than in wartime Japan. These medical reports circulated through occupation offices and reconstruction departments, further highlighting the contrast between two systems, one collapsing under militaristic extremism, the other administering humanitarian care even in victory. For the American occupation forces, the repatriation of Japanese civilians, including thousands of women, became one of the occupation's most successful psychological victories. It humanized the occupiers at a time when Japan's future depended on collaboration, rebuilding, and a rejection of wartime ideology. General MacArthur understood that to reshape Japan, the occupation had to be more than political reformation. It had to be a social transformation. The stories brought back by these women aided that transformation more effectively than any broadcast or leaflet. Still, the women's experiences were not without pain. Many faced suspicion when they returned home. Some neighbors accused them of lying to gain favor with the Americans. Others whispered that they had been too cooperative with the enemy. A few women, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, refused to speak about their captivity for decades. Yet even among those who stayed silent, the truth simmered quietly beneath the surface, altering the way they raised their children, the values they taught them, and the ways they spoke of war. As Japan rebuilt itself in the late 1940s and 1950s, the memory of American generosity during captivity became a small but steady thread woven into the nation's evolving identity. It influenced how Japanese citizens viewed democracy, humanitarianism, and international cooperation. It shaped the way school children learned about the war in later decades. And for many of the women themselves, the experience remained an emotional anchor, a reminder that even within the devastation of conflict, dignity could survive. Reflecting on this event with the calm distance of history, it becomes clear why. The stories of these women matter. They remind us that war is not only fought with guns and aircraft, but with narratives, beliefs, fears, and the fragile psychology of entire nations. Propaganda had taught these women to expect cruelty, but their lived experience taught them something the war had tried to erase: the humanity of the other side. Their story also shows how the smallest act's a bowl of soup, a bandaged wound, a warm blanket, a guard who looks away to offer privacy can become decisive turning points in the aftermath of violence. These moments did not change the outcome of the war, but they changed how a defeated nation saw its conqueror. They laid a foundation for Japan's transformation from enemy to ally, and for a post-war world that would rely on cooperation rather than conquest. In the end, the return of Japan's female prisoners was more than a logistical operation. It was a moral revelation. Through them, the Japanese people glimpsed a version of the Americans that contradicted every wartime warning. And through their quiet testimonies, they carried home a message that shaped the early years of peace, that even in the ruins of war, compassion could be stronger than fear, and generosity more enduring than propaganda. With their footsteps across the pier, their stories whispered in broken homes, and their memories preserved in hidden diaries, the narrative of America's generosity became an unexpected bridge between former enemies. It remains one of the most revealing and overlooked chapters of World War II, a testament not to the weapons that ended the conflict, but to the humanity that helped heal its wounds.